In medieval Europe, the art of war was not merely a matter of brute strength or wielding a sword with reckless enthusiasm. It was a complex machine requiring preparation, discipline, and a touch of ingenuity to transform peasants, artisans, and even the least promising son of a noble into soldiers capable of enduring the chaos of battle. The training and recruitment of soldiers in this era was not a standardized process like today's military academies and instruction manuals. Rather, it was a blend of pragmatism, improvisation, and traditions that varied by region, feudal lord, and the urgency of the situation. While the romantic image of a gallant knight on horseback often dominates our imagination, the reality was far grittier, more diverse, and sometimes even comical in its disorder. Let's dive into this fascinating world where sweat, blood, and the occasional absurd anecdote forged the warriors of old. Recruitment in the Middle Ages was hardly a local newspaper ad or a flashy advertising campaign with catchy slogans. Most soldiers didn't choose to fight. War came to them, whether through feudal obligation, economic necessity, or, in some cases, sheer boredom. The feudal system, which dominated Europe between the 9th and 15th centuries, was structured like a pyramid with the king or feudal lord at the top and peasants at the base, who, besides working the land, were the primary source of military manpower. When a lord needed an army, he summoned his vassals, who in turn called upon the men of their lands. These peasants, accustomed to handling hoes rather than swords, were recruited under the principle that, if you can hold a stick, you can hold a spear. It was hardly a meritocratic process. Recruitment varied by context. In times of peace, feudal lords maintained small contingents of armed men, often knights or professional soldiers known as men-at-arms. These were the medieval equivalent of elite professionals, though they weren't always as elite as we like to imagine. Some were second-tier nobles, others mercenaries who switched sides based on the weight of the coin purse. In times of war, however, things got more serious. Mass levies could summon any able-bodied man between 16 and 60, though able-bodied was a flexible term. If you could walk and not faint at the sight of blood, you were likely on the list. In England, for example, Anglo-Saxon and later Norman laws required free men to serve in the FYRD, a local militia activated in times of crisis. Imagine a farmer, after a day of plowing, being told he must show up at dawn with an improvised weapon. There wasn't much room to say, "I'd rather stay home." Recruitment wasn't always so coercive. Some men volunteered, drawn by the promise of loot, land, or simply a chance to escape the monotony of rural life. Tournaments, the reality shows of the era, also served as a stage for young men to showcase their skills and catch the eye of a lord willing to pay for a skilled swordsman. However, not all recruits were eager volunteers. During the Crusades, for instance, a mix of religious fervor, social pressure, and the promise of eternal salvation convinced many to take the cross, though they often didn't grasp what awaited them across the Mediterranean. More than one must have thought the Holy Land sounded exotic until they found themselves trudging under a scorching sun in armor heavier than their mule. Once recruited, soldiers needed training, and this is where things get interesting. There were no military academies with shouting instructors and structured programs. Training depended heavily on the type of soldier being shaped and the resources available. Knights, the military elite of the time, began their preparation as children. At 7 or 8, a noble would send his son to another lord's household as a page, where he learned manners, horsemanship, and, with luck, how not to fall headfirst while trying to swing a sword. Later, as a squire, the young man became a knight's personal assistant, polishing armor, tending horses, and learning the art of war hands-on. This system, while effective in creating competent warriors, wasn't without its absurd moments. Picture a teenage squire struggling to load a horse with full armor while the knight yells at him not to scratch the metal. It was learning by trial and error, with heavy emphasis on error. For knights, training was both physical and mental. They learned to wield a variety of weapons: swords, lances, maces, axes, and later, with the rise of plate armor, weapons designed to pierce metal, like the warhammer. Horsemanship was crucial, as a knight without a horse was like a chef without a knife. Technically still functional, but not quite the same. Tournaments, beyond being social spectacles, were intensive training grounds. Though meant to be friendly contests, serious injuries and deaths were not uncommon. A knight could hone his skills in a tournament and end up with a broken arm or, worse, his pride shattered before the local nobility. Foot soldiers, who made up the bulk of armies, didn't receive such sophisticated training. Many were peasants who barely knew how to hold a spear properly, and their preparation was often a crash course in not dying in the first minute of battle. In England, for example, the longbow became popular, and villagers were required to practice archery on Sundays after church. This not only improved their aim but also kept young men out of trouble, or so the lords hoped. The longbow required significant strength and years of practice to master, but the English turned it into an art, as seen in battles like Agincourt in 1415, where archers decimated French cavalry as if playing a medieval video game with cheats enabled. Discipline was a key component of training, though it wasn't always achieved. Medieval armies weren't exactly known for impeccable order. Foot soldiers, often conscripted by force, could be unruly, and commanders had to deal with desertions, internal fights, and, in some cases, epic pre-battle drinking binges. Mercenaries, increasingly common from the 13th century, were particularly troublesome. These hired soldiers were combat experts but also adept at switching sides if pay was late. Training such a diverse group required charismatic leaders and, sometimes, a bit of intimidation. Punishments for disobedience ranged from whippings to execution, though commanders knew they couldn't be too harsh if they wanted to keep their men motivated. Equipment also played a crucial role in training. Knights learned to move in armor weighing 20 to 30 kilos, requiring significant strength and endurance. Contrary to popular belief, armor wasn't as uncomfortable as movies suggest. It was designed to distribute weight evenly, but fighting in it was still like training for a marathon with a backpack full of bricks. Foot soldiers, on the other hand, typically had basic gear: a spear, a shield, and maybe a helmet if they were lucky. Some carried improvised weapons like sickles or clubs, making medieval armies sometimes resemble a mix of a military force and an angry mob. Combat tactics were also part of training, though these varied by region and leader. In the 9th and 10th centuries, formations were relatively simple: a line of men with shields and spears, hoping the enemy tired out first. Over time, tactics grew more complex. Knights learned to coordinate cavalry charges, while archers and crossbowmen practiced mass volleys to weaken the enemy before direct combat. Shrewd commanders, like Richard the Lionheart, understood the importance of logistics and morale, training their men to hold formation under pressure. However, not all leaders were tactical geniuses. More than one battle was lost because a lord decided a head-on charge was as good a strategy as any. Training also included a psychological component. Medieval warfare was brutal, and soldiers had to be prepared for the horror of wounds, death, and chaos. Knights, schooled in the code of chivalry, were trained to maintain composure and honor, though this wasn't always upheld in practice. Foot soldiers relied on camaraderie and, at times, a strong drink to keep their spirits up. Songs, stories, and promises of loot helped boost morale, though they weren't always enough to stop a recruit from fleeing at the sight of an enemy cavalry charge. A curious aspect of medieval training was the role of religion. The church held immense influence, and many soldiers were trained not only to fight but to believe they were fighting for a divine cause. This was especially true in the Crusades, where preachers accompanied armies and delivered sermons before battles to inspire the men. It wasn't uncommon for a priest to bless weapons or for soldiers to pray together before facing the enemy. This not only bolstered morale but also served as a kind of mental training to accept the possibility of death. As the Middle Ages progressed, training and recruitment became more organized, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries. Cities began forming urban militias, and kings created more permanent armies. In England, Edward III and Henry V perfected the combined use of archers and men-at-arms, requiring more coordinated training. On the continent, mercenary companies like the Great Catalan Company professionalized, offering their services to the highest bidder. These groups trained regularly, giving them an edge over peasant levies, though their loyalty was as sturdy as a house of cards in a storm. Not everything in medieval training was serious. There were moments of humor, intentional or not. Chronicles of the time tell of soldiers who, during training, accidentally hit themselves with their own weapons or fell off horses mid-demonstration. Tournaments, though dangerous, also had their share of comedy, with knights taking their heroic roles too seriously only to be unhorsed on the first clash. Even in the Crusades, where seriousness should have prevailed, there were tales of soldiers misunderstanding orders or getting lost in the desert chasing a mirage they thought was an oasis. In summary, the training and recruitment of medieval soldiers was as varied as the Middle Ages itself. From knights who spent years perfecting their craft to peasants who learned to hold a spear in a week, every soldier had a role on the battlefield. Though they lacked the technology and organization of modern armies, medieval men made up for it with ingenuity, resilience, and sometimes a good dose of luck. The next time you imagine a medieval battle, don't just think of swords gleaming in the sun. Think of the farmer who, with a rusty spear and an ill-fitting helmet, faced chaos hoping to return home with a story to tell. Or, at least, with all his limbs intact.